So let's talk about 10 dumb errors of the less tactical variety when you're playing Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd focus on mistakes in 40k games, this time going with a bit of a theme of things that you really realise that you shouldn't have done in hindsight, but with 40k being a complex game with a lot going on, it's not that hard to forget some things in the turn process, making sequencing errors or trying to bite off more than you can chew. So with that in mind, let's take a look at 10 common silly mistakes in 40k, which I think I must have done almost all of over the years. After you've watched the video, I'll be quite interested to hear how many of these you've done in games yourself. First up, we have forgetting reserves. In 40k match play, reserves come in on rounds 2 or 3, they're not allowed to come in later. So if you happen to look at your army's carry case or movement tray on round 4, then it can be quite unfortunate to realise that there's been something that's been sitting out the game that really should have made its presence felt last turn. I think this one's at least relatively easily done. In 40k there's usually quite a lot going on. It's not too hard to get bogged down in calculations or plans for what you have on the board and then skip straight to shooting, and then only realise the absence of your crucial reinforcements later in the turn or even in the next one. I think it's perhaps most easily done for units that aren't an enormous threat, maybe small units of objective grabbers or skirmishers perhaps, ones that would be really handy to have come down for missions and things, but perhaps not a unit that you've been clearly waiting for the entire game long. I guess if a mistake like this is made, then it kind of depends on how generous your opponent wants to be with them. I've seen people say that you can just set them up turn 4, as they'd rather have fought their entire opponent's army rather than just most of it. Or I guess you could offer just to put down the unit somewhere safe and away from their forces where they wouldn't have reasonably got killed the last turn, and just assume that they sat there doing nothing during that turn to punish you for your forgetfulness. Another one that can feel really quite stupid in hindsight is to split fire when you absolutely need something dead, and then you wind up leaving a crucial massive unit on just a tiny bit of health left with nothing else left to fire at it. Sometimes this can be harder to achieve than others, and it genuinely can be a bit of a gamble weighing up the shooting phase. You don't really want to overkill the enemy target and wind up wasting loads of firepower, but on the other hand you don't really want to be greedy, vastly overestimate how much your guns are realistically going to be able to do, and then wind up splitting fire between a whole bunch of things and not actually kill anything completely. I think out of the two, it's usually going to be better to err on the side of making sure that things are killed dead, and maybe accept a little bit of damage loss for that, as even a slightly low chance of something massive surviving could be a really big swing in the game. I'm sure a lot of people have had a situation where they've tried to kill something big like an Imperial Knight, left it on just the one wounds remaining, and then it's gone on to do an entire extra phase of powerful damage dealing, due to it basically being still functional. Definitely a mistake that you can make both ways, but it certainly feels dumb in hindsight if you manage to leave something important on one wound, and you think in hindsight that your shooting phase could have gone very differently if you'd chosen to reallocate stuff. Perhaps in a similar vein in the fight phase, though a bit more of an easy decision, there's resolving combats in the wrong order. This comes into play if you've got multiple combats going on in different parts of the board, as if the opponent's got that 2 command points left to use the counter-offensive stratagem, then it often means that you can fight with exactly one combat and then your opponent will be fighting next. If you forget that that's a threat, you might just pick a really easy combat to resolve first, say Gilliman here beating up some Chaos Cultists, forgetting that your opponent could use the counter-offensive in a much more balanced combat, say these Khorne Berserkers versus the Blade Guard, and then they cut them all down before they even had chance to swing. If you'd just resolved the Blade Guard combat first, then you'd probably have killed most of the Khorne Berserkers before they got to fight, and it wouldn't even be worth the Chaos player interrupting with the cultists, as they're not likely to do anything significant against Gilliman. As this can easily swing combats, this is a massive deal if it does come up on something important, and I think sometimes it's not that hard to be a little bit careless, get sucked in by fighting with the big shiny thing that's about to absolutely destroy what it's targeting, and not realise that it might be better to actually resolve a more minor combat first. Next, as a 9th edition specific problem, we have forgetting actions. I think actions are one of those things that still don't feel enormously intuitive in 40k. They go off with a similar set of rules, but a lot of them trigger at different phases in the game. A particular and slightly fiddly example is at the end of the movement phase for things like retrieve Nachman's data, as you might be thinking about reserves and thinking about going on to shooting then, so it might well get forgotten, or you might just have planned for one of your backfield objective holders to do the action and then actually forget to declare it sometime in the movement phase, meaning that they won't have done it at all unless your opponent is willing to be generous. I think for people using these secondaries, it's one of the most common things that I see people forget. My personal philosophy on that one is that if the squad wasn't going to do anything anyway, I don't really have any problem with the opponent remembering later and saying, "So sorry, can that squad do Nachman data?" For me, it just doesn't really feel like it's changed any decisions from the game. If all that squad was doing was, say, hunkering down on an objective. It's very much up to your opponent, though. It's kind of up to them if they want to let you go back and do it if you've forgotten it, but they don't have to. Next, as well as being greedy in the shooting phase, you can certainly be greedy in the charge phase, and some of the time perhaps the hardest decision that you can make is to not charge an enemy unit. Even if you happen to have some of your elite assault troops nearby, sometimes they're just not going to be enough. Charging and fighting in 40k can always be a bit swingy depending on how well the dice rolls go. There is always the potential just to get a bit unlucky and your opponent, say, roll loads of saves. But obviously that isn't going to be helped much if you've just vastly overestimated how much damage you're going to do to the opponent's units, and vice versa if they interrupt or strike back. Other things that can turn a glorious charge into a complete disaster are things like surprise fight last abilities. Say, for example, the Temporacopia relic hidden in a big unit of Rust Stalkers for AdMech, or their stratagem where they can get fights last on their tech priests. Or say engaging more units than you thought you might have done, say tying up multiple targets and they hit back harder than you'd expect. The 2CP interrupt stratagem basically guaranteeing that the opponent's going to be striking before you if you've got an important combat that needs resolving elsewhere, falling foul of heroic intervention and having to fight a bunch of characters as well as the unit, or a few rare stratagems that can allow the enemy to countercharge into you, say for example the Salamanders have one. Overall, it does mean that sometimes the best choice is just literally to leave a good melee unit sitting out to die just in front of the enemy. It's certainly not always going to be the case, but if literally all that's likely to happen is for your unit to charge in and get cut to ribbons, it's probably better that the opponent has to do that in their turn as opposed to you gifting it to them in yours. Next up is Deep Strike Screening. Arriving from reserves in 9th edition is generally very predictable. If you can have your units zoning out a 9-inch zone around your entire army, then the opponent isn't going to be able to put anything in there. The main issue is that you don't want to do almost all of the deep strike screening and then just leave a crucial gap that's big enough for you to deep strike into, particularly if it allows efficient enemy damage dealers just to chew up one of your biggest and baddest threats. If your opponent's got significant scary reserves, it usually does make sense to properly measure out the 9-inch exclusion zone, including things like putting units in the corners of the board to stop them coming in at the very back. And I must admit I have fallen foul of just eyeballing things once or twice. In particular, in one game, I remember underestimating just how compactly a drop pod and devastators could deploy. With the arms folded up and the devastators largely tucked under the drop pod base, they really don't have as big a footprint as I thought they would, and they managed to neatly slot into the corner at the back of the board and then proceed to murder one of my knights. Depending on what army you're playing, it can often be fairly easy to zone out whole areas with maximally spread small units, and a lot of the time it can be a fair bit easier than you think to basically stop your opponent dropping in your deployment zone whatsoever, particularly if you're playing one of the armies that isn't particularly elite. Next up is falling victim to true line of sight in Warhammer 40k, and getting an entire important unit killed just because you left one tiny prong of a model stuck round the corner. Again, this was something I'd recently fallen foul of with a unit of Genestealer called Acolytes. I had a big scary squad that was largely dropped somewhere safe. They failed their charge when they came in, but they were largely hidden behind terrain anyway. The issue being that I hadn't really considered that one of them just had their knives just sticking out very slightly round terrain, and it actually made the entire difference whether the whole squad would live or die, as it meant that the entirety of a powerful shooting unit could all get line of sight on it and proceed to blow them away with gusto, when otherwise they would have been a very nasty threat hidden from the rest of the enemy's guns. It is a bit of a niggle of 9th edition's line of sight rules, I guess. It always feels a little bit ridiculous when you have an entire unit killed just because there's an exploded aerial or something like that, though still in my mind it's the lesser of two evils, and just being able to draw line of sight to any point on the model gets rid of any debates as to what counts or what does not count in terms of line of sight. In any case, I'd certainly be a little bit wary of the models that are set up around the edges of your unit, particularly ones with overhanging swords and things like that. A little bit of effort to make sure that there's no wayward limbs or tentacles escaping from behind cover can often go a long way to keeping the squad not dead. Next up, when you're charging a unit, it can make a massive difference between whether or not you make a charge and kill the enemy, or don't make a charge and then you don't. And this can often be at odds with wanting to do damage in your psychic and shooting phase. Often if you're charging an enemy infantry unit that's got multiple models in it, you don't really want to be causing massive shooting or psychic damage to it and making your charge far longer. For example, if we have Mortarion here, who's got a crazy amount of powerful melee, he wants to be charging into those Space Marines, and genuinely it could be a good idea for him to just forget that he even has Smite, as if he uses it, kills this front Space Marine, then it means he's actually significantly less likely to make his charge. Maybe it's gone from an easy 5-inch charge to a 7-inch charge, still odds on to make, but if he does fail it, then he's just cost himself a whole lot of damage. I'd say it's perhaps most easily done on 9-inch deep strike charges. They're already pretty hard to make, and even just gaining 1 extra inch onto that charge distance will reduce the probability of you making it by a lot. Generally, one of the best ideas can be that, if possible, to try and have your models within 9 inches of multiple different enemy models. That way you might be able to afford to kill 1 or 2 and still have that guaranteed 9-inch charge. In any case, I guess the main takeaway is that sometimes not shooting or smiting an enemy unit is best, and it's hard to weigh up the trade-off between losing a bit of damage in the earlier phases and then potentially having the small chance of losing a lot in the assault phase. Next, another complete facepalm moment can be when you bring a unit in from reserve, just to have it gone straight back off the board with an interception stratagem and put back in the box. We've talked about Auspex scan in a video recently on the channel, but there's plenty of others throughout 40k. The Eldar have one within 18 inches and near a Farseer. The Thousand Sons have an 18-inch version of Auspex scan as well, which can be pretty fearsome with Scarab Occult Terminators. Chaos Alpha Legion have one, Tempestus Scions, and there's lots of other examples, either in stratagems, pieces of war gear, or sometimes things like warlord traits or point cost upgrades. In general, it's just another very easy way to throw away a unit that you didn't mean to, particularly when you could always have just dropped further back or out of line of sight. The vast majority of the time it's going to make more sense to drop hidden and then come out and fight the next turn, rather than just immediately die if the opponent's spending 2 command points or something. I suppose occasionally you could be trying to use units to bait out the last few CP that your opponent has and deny them powerful options later, but I feel for that to be worth the trade-off, your unit would have to be really quite cheap that you're sacrificing. In general though, Auspex scan or similar stratagems usually trigger just because your opponent's forgotten the option that you have, and if you are using reserves, it's well worth just asking your opponent if they have any intercept-like abilities in their army when you are deploying them on the board. Finally, and depending how dangerously you like to live, another great hindsight is 2020 moment can be when you've spent your last command point and then you've just failed a really easy charge that's almost guaranteed to be a success if you had a reroll available. In general, the philosophy of command points tends to be to want to spend them fairly early in the game to try and get early advantages, but at the same time, if you do completely run out, then you put yourself most at risk of just very bad luck striking and you not being able to do anything about it. And most charges do at least have the possibility of having a low chance to fail them. If your assault intercessors randomly get caught flat-footed and roll a double 1 when all they needed was a 4, then the difference in damage output could be horrendous. Maybe whatever unit they were about to charge surprisingly lives, and then might even be able to kill them the next turn. In general, trying to mitigate the low risk of something very bad going wrong can be leading to very tough decisions when the command point reserves get low. It could sometimes be very tricky between dealing some guaranteed massive increased damage and warding off against bad luck, for example in the charge phase. So anyway, I think we'll leave that one there for now. Let me know how many of these 10 that you've done over the years yourselves. I look forward to having a read down in the comments below. I suspect I'm personally on 9 or 10, though I would like to think that having made mistakes, you're kind of less likely to make them in future games. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention one way in which you can help support, and that's the Auspex Tactics Patreon page down in the video description. Making all the Warhammer videos does take a fair amount of time and effort, and if you are enjoying quite a bit, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.